Hey everyone, and welcome to Curious Finds, your go-to spot for those real in-depth explorations.
Glad to be here.
Today on the deep dive, we're tackling a really significant issue, I think. It's the impact of Indian news media on the country's, well, its social structure.
Yeah, the social fabric, as they say. We've been digging into this material called Breaking the Nation, how Indian news media is dividing India.
Right. It started as a podcast script, then became a YouTube video with Aman and Naina presenting.
That's the one. And our goal here is basically to pull out the main ideas from their analysis, try to understand these big shifts in Indian news.
And what it all means for society, right?
Yeah.
What the consequences might be.
Exactly. And what really jumps out right from the start looking at this stuff is just how much the landscape seems to have changed over there.
Changed how? Like, what's different?
Well, the priorities seem totally different in terms of what gets covered, what gets the airtime.
Okay. The source material, it points back to a time when Indian news was more about, say, farmers' issues, government policy, holding power accountable.
Yeah, Aman in the source really highlights that. A clear focus on those kinds of, bread and butter issues. But now
It's drifted. Towards what?
Towards stuff that grabs attention, maybe? Celebrity news, lots of religious debates that get pretty intense, and just a ton of political drama.
Right. And Naina, in the source, she asks that key question. Who actually benefits? When huge issues like rising inflation just get pushed aside.
For debates about boycotting a movie or temple politics. Makes you wonder what's driving the editorial choices.
It really does. And the source uses a visual for this, right? A comparison.
Yeah, it's quite striking. They show, an old Doordarshan news anchor from the 90s, very calm, very composed.
Okay.
And then they contrast that with the chaos you often see on today's debate shows, people shouting.
Almost like shouting matches instead of debates.
Yeah.
It highlights how the whole presentation, the style, has shifted.
And it's not just a feeling. They had data, a graph, I think.
Oh, yeah. What did it show?
It showed the rise of this, entertainment-style news. Pretty steady climb from 2008 to 2024.
And the interesting part.
The TRP spikes the ratings, basically, which means ad money that seem to happen during big elections, and also, disturbingly, during times of riots or unrest.
So that suggests maybe a link between, sensationalism and viewership.
It certainly raises the question, if drama and high emotion get more eyes, well, that creates a certain incentive, doesn't it?
Yeah, an incentive that might not align with just informing the public objectively.
Exactly. Which brings us to a really sensitive point the source dives into. The role of religion in all this.
Okay, this seems central to their argument.
It really is. The source argues that a lot of primetime news seems geared towards creating a Hindu versus Muslim binary. It's a constant theme.
How does that play out? I mean, how do they say it happens?
Well, Naina in the source talks about how newsrooms can kind of amplify voices that maybe started on the fringes.
Give them a huge platform.
Right, like one viral clip from some religious figure, maybe saying something inflammatory, can suddenly become the national conversation for days.
Wow. So it shows how narratives can be built up, almost manufactured sometimes.
That's the implication. And Aman really stresses the danger in that this constant othering, painting one whole community as the outsider.
That kind of framing, done repeatedly, it has to have an impact.
You'd think so. The source gives examples like constant debates on things like wearing the hijab or arguments over halal meat or this love jihad idea, while, as we said, major economic issues that affect everyone just don't get the same consistent airtime.
And the source backs this up. Beyond just anecdotes.
Yeah, they showed some interesting visuals, quotes from fact-checking groups showing how context was twisted in some news reports.
Okay.
And also Google Trends data. You could see searches for communal terms spiking right after some of these heated TV debates.
So a correlation, at least. Doesn't prove causation, but it's suggestive.
Definitely suggestive. And it leads you to ask, okay, what's behind these trends? Why this focus?
And the source points towards
media ownership. That's a huge factor they raise. Who owns the major news outlets in India, and what are their political interests?
The money trail.
Pretty much. Naina points out the obvious conflict of interest when media channels are owned by big companies or individuals with clear political ties.
It makes true independence difficult, maybe impossible.
That's the concern. Can you really report critically on people or parties you have deep business or political links with?
The source gave an example, didn't it? About a story that didn't get much coverage.
Yeah, the Pegasus spyware story. Huge international story about potential government spying on journalists, activists, politicians.
Right.
But the source notes it got comparatively limited, sustained coverage in some major Indian outlets, which raises questions about self-censorship.
If the owners or people they're connected to don't want a story covered, maybe it just fades away.
That's the risk. And they even showed like an ownership map.
Laying it out.
Yeah, visually showing the ownership structures of big channels like Z, Republic, India TV, ABP News. Seeing it mapped out, it really drives home how interconnected media and political power can be.
Which brings us to that term they discussed, Godi Media.
Right. They mentioned journalist Ravish Kumar using that term. It translates roughly to lapdog media.
Implying media that's cozy with the government, acting like a mouthpiece.
That's the idea. And Nainina, in the source, observes how some anchors, it really seems like their main priority is showing loyalty to the ruling party rather than, objective reporting.
And it affects the format, too, the debates.
Absolutely. Amnon describes how these debates often seem set up to just drown out anyone who disagrees with the dominant narrative.
How so?
You'll often see, multiple panelists all pushing the same line, the same pro-government or specific ideological view, and maybe just one person trying to offer a different perspective who then gets shouted down or interrupted constantly.
So it's not really a debate in good faith.
Doesn't sound like it. The source mentions tactics like yelling, mocking people, even muting their mics if they're saying something inconvenient.
Wow.
It's presented as less about finding truth and more about controlling the narrative. There was even this, animated meme thing in the source.
Oh, yeah?
Called Welcome to the Anchor Show. It kind of satirized the whole thing, the anchor as the star, orchestrating the chaos, ensuring the right message gets through.
So a performance rather than journalism.
That's the critique. And you can imagine this kind of environment. It must be incredibly tough for journalists who just want to do their jobs, honestly.
What does the source say happens to them? The ones who push back or try to maintain independence?
It sounds pretty grim, honestly. Both Naina and Aman talk about journalists being pushed to the margins, losing their jobs.
That's serious?
Yeah, and even facing legal threats like sedition charges, which is incredibly serious, plus online harassment, trolling. It's a full-on assault sometimes.
So the space for independent journalism on mainstream TV is shrinking.
That's what the source strongly suggests. They point to well-known journalists like Ravish Kumar, Punyaplasun Bajpai, Abhisar Sharma, people with established careers who've largely moved off TV and onto platforms like YouTube to continue their work.
That's telling, isn't it? When established figures feel they can't do their work freely in the traditional space.
Very telling. The source even had a visual comparing, the old NDTV newsroom, a big established setup, with Ravish Kumar's current, much simpler YouTube studio.
A symbol of that shift.
Exactly. A symbol of the struggle for independent voices.
Okay, so we've talked about the changing landscape, the role of religion, ownership, the pressure on journalists. What's the end result? What's the societal damage, according to the source?
They argue it's significant, this constant diet of divisive news, this us versus them narrative. It breeds distrust. It can foster real hatred between communities. And in the worst cases, it can contribute to actual violence.
I draw a link to things like communal riots.
Yes, they suggest that these riots often don't just happen out of nowhere. They can be the culmination of long periods of this kind of divisive storytelling in the media, creating a volatile atmosphere.
A heavy charge.
It is. And the division isn't just abstract, societal level. They say it's breaking down relationships personally.
How so?
Between friends, neighbors, even within families. People consuming different news, believing completely different narratives fed to them. It's driving wedges between people who used to get along.
Wow. The source had an example of that.
Yeah, an acted interview quote, I think. Someone talking about how their neighbor just stopped talking to them completely after getting riled up by a TV news debate.
That's incredibly sad.
Yeah.
It brings it down to a very human level.
Definitely. And they paired that with data apparently showing increases in communal incidents after these really polarizing news cycles. Again, correlation, but concerning.
Okay, so the picture painted is pretty bleak in some ways. Does the source offer any hope? Any potential way forward?
It does, actually. It's not all doom and gloom. They point to the rise of independent digital media as a real counterforce.
The online platforms.
Exactly. Places like The Wire, Scroll, Article 14, news websites doing investigative work, and also independent creators on YouTube doing analysis and reporting. They list several examples.
So technology enabling alternative voices.
Precisely. It offers a space for different perspectives, for more fact-focused reporting outside the pressures of the big corporate political structures.
That's hopeful. What else?
A lot of emphasis is placed on us, the audience, the citizens.
On media literacy.
Basically, yeah. Becoming much more critical consumers of news, asking questions. Who owns this channel? What might their agenda be? Is this information verified?
So not just passively consuming, but actively interrogating what we watch and read.
Exactly. The Force encourages people to actively support real journalism, maybe through subscriptions or donations to independent outlets, and to share fact-based stuff, call out fake news when you see it, be part of the solution, essentially.
It's about reclaiming the information space, in a way.
That's a good way to put it. The Source had visuals of, like, young journalists out reporting, citizen journalists, crowdfunding platforms, showing there's still a fight for good information.
Right. Okay, so let's try to wrap this up. Key takeaways from this deep dive into the source material.
Well, we saw this big shift in Indian news, less focus on core issues, more on sensationalism, drama.
A troubling use of religious narratives to potentially create division. The Hindu-Muslim binary being a major focus.
Yeah, and the huge influence of corporate and political ownership, raising questions about independence and leading to this Godi Media phenomenon.
Which in turn marginalizes journalists trying to do independent work, pushing them online or out of the profession.
And the end result, the Source argues, is real societal damage, distrust, hatred, division, reaching even personal relationships.
But with some hope offered by independent digital media and the call for audiences to be much more critical.
Exactly. It really comes back to that need for critical thinking about what media we consume.
Yeah, the source really prompts you, the listener, to think hard about where your news comes from, what biases might be shaping it.
And it ends with that powerful idea how vital truth and reliable journalism are for any healthy democracy. We need to protect it.
Absolutely. It leaves us with a question really for everyone listening. How can you personally become a more discerning news consumer in this really complicated media world? What steps can you take?
Definitely something to reflect on.
For more deep dives like this one, exploring important issues, definitely like this video and subscribe to our YouTube channel, Curious Minds.
Thanks for joining us.